Welcome back. Now, the ANC faces the intricate task of trying to forge a coalition government. The discussion over coalition partners comes, of course, after the ANC lost its majority for the first time since the end of apartheid. Now, it remains the largest party, but it can no longer govern alone. President Cyril Ramaphosa has made it clear that any coalition agreement would have to be within the framework of the current constitution. And Parliament must, of course, convene to elect a president within 2 weeks of the vote being declared. Now, what are the significant challenges and, of course, also opportunities perhaps ahead in terms of foreign policy implications? Joining us virtually to share his thoughts about this is Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Bhaso Ndzendze. Professor, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Sakina. Good to be with you.
So there are so many scenarios being sketched at the moment in terms of who the ANC should go with and why. And one of the questions is, of course, given the very prominent role that South Africa has taken on the world stage, bringing the case before the International Court of Justice involving Palestine and, of course, Israel. One of the questions that we have to look at is how are these coalition talks going to impact on South Africa's foreign policy position? So starting at that point, and then we'll move to others, what should the ANC be thinking and considering at this point?
Sure. I wish I could enter the minds of our politicians. I'm sure millions of South Africans would agree that they wish they had that superpower at this moment. But what I can say for sure is that the ANC recognizes that South Africa is not a military power. It's not an economic powerhouse. What South Africa really has is a voice. And that voice needs to have a coherent message. So one of the things that the ANC must be thinking about at this moment is how do we get a kind of coalition where we would have untrammeled power in terms of foreign policy, so that though we may share power domestically, we want to have a portfolio such as the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, in addition, of course, to the presidency. But they must also be aware that the making of foreign policy no longer relies solely on the Department of International Relations and Cooperation anymore. In fact, almost every department in the South African government has a foreign affairs desk, including, for example, higher education. I play a role here at the university in education internationalization, and our go-to document does not come from DERCO. It comes from the Department of Higher Education and Training, which says it sees for itself a role in the making of South African foreign policy. So it's quite a scenario for the ANC to find itself in. There was that also famous moment in December 2016 when the then DA Mayor, Solly Msimanga, visited Taiwan, which, of course, South Africa does not recognize under the ANC government. So it's about accommodating those kinds of views, various opportunities to also undermine each other. No matter what kind of coalition agreement you come up with, there's going to be lots of landmines that they're going to be walking into, which threatens the stability of whatever government would come about, no matter whether they agree on domestic issues.
So I'm glad you touched on the one China policy that the ANC subscribes to vis-a-vis the DA making that overture towards Taiwan, and who knows, how that would shape up in time to come. But you've got that issue. Then you've got Ukraine and Russia. And you have Israel, Palestine. And these are all spaces in which the ANC and the DA in that foreign policy space differ on. So when people talk about this being a preferred coalition, how is this likely to play out when they now have to find some form of compromise on what seems to be very hardline issues for both of their constituencies?
Absolutely. These are wedge issues. Somebody who went to vote for the DA would have done so in part because they would have liked the fact that John Steenhuisen has undertaken visits to Ukraine and has engaged publicly with the ambassador of Ukraine to express solidarity with that country, contrary to the ANC government's position in that conflict. And yes, on the other hand, that he then dismissed a shadow minister in his shadow cabinet last year because of a pro-Palestine position that he held. This is Galeb Kochelia. So this is going to be one of those landmines I referred to earlier, where in as much as they can find each other on domestic issues, they cannot anticipate what the next crisis will be and what their base will stand whether on those issues. If country X invades country Y, the DA base may think that this is unfathomable. The ANC base may think that this is challenging of NATO and challenging of the West, which they find to be imperialistic. So I would make the prediction that if not on domestic issues, then certainly on the basis of foreign affairs, whatever coalition comes about is going to struggle, including, by the way, even a party like the EFF, which holds very strong views, much more extreme than the ANC on certain issues, including, for example, calling for basically a cancellation of South Africa's relations with Eswatini because they do not find the king's human rights record to be worthwhile, to be good. So they want to have him, in a sense, condemned by the SADC. That's what their manifesto says, that they will lobby SADC to condemn the king of Eswatini as a war criminal. So you could go on and on, even on BRICS. DA thinks it's a waste of money. It's a waste of 180 million rand last year's summit, whereas the ANC walked away out of that feeling very good about itself, that it is part of this important grouping of emerging economies in the world that are challenging Western imperialism. On the other hand, the DA wrote a letter to the US asking them to play an even more prominent role in safeguarding what they considered to be threatened elections in South Africa this year. So again, there's lots of landmines here that particularly the DA and the ANC would find themselves walking into, but even other parties as well EFF has called, for example, for arming of Hamas. So would this now be South Africa's official position with that particular party to be accommodated? So lots of paradoxes and trade-offs here.
And they certainly are very, very important issues, Professor. So again, what would be the best solution in your view? And I know it's a tough question because we are seeing, again, researchers doing some work, coming up with scenarios that have 1, 2, or maybe even more political parties as part of this coalition with the African National Congress. There is, of course, also a scenario that looks at a government of national unity. But which would you say would be best if we look from a foreign policy position for South Africa? Because as you just outlined, just looking at the issues that we touched on, it's going to be a bruising battle of ideas to make sure that everybody is happy and can go back to their constituencies with whatever they had promised still intact.
Absolutely. So one of the things I'm hopeful out of this coalition is that the quality of our ambassadors will increase, will become much more suitable to the job. Currently, we have individuals who are not suited to that role, but have been appointed to those roles because of political party considerations and because of one party's dominance over the staffing of embassies, which is not to say that there aren't ambassadors who are good at their job. But I think there can be a professionalization of ambassadors because different parties now have to accommodate each other. They may just say then the best people should get the job, not because we want to reward certain individuals politically or distance certain individuals from and sort of exile them because they are a threat to the politically speaking internally. I would also hope that whatever formation comes about will put trade first in terms of our foreign policy and really work towards making use of that avenue to solve the domestic issue of high unemployment. I cannot, of course, predict or suggest what kind of coalition. I'm not particularly in that business, but I would hope that then these key priorities of professionalization of our diplomatic corps, as well as leading with trade, would find expression in whatever coalition agreement comes about that must then work towards the best interests of the people of South Africa. And I would hope also, for the sake of stability, that they can have some kind of agreement as to where they stand on conflicts and how do they manage the next sort of conflict that breaks out, where they may be on different sides, so that there is stability.
Professor Ndzendze, I really appreciate that. Very interesting. And we were just looking at a higher level further geopolitically. We haven't even focused on what's happening right next door and further on the continent as well. But I suppose the points would hold, but of course in a more nuanced way. Thanks so much, Professor Ndzendze, for your time. Professor Bhaso Ndzendze, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Just looking at our foreign policy position there, Leanne. Whew. Yeah, it's a tough one.